purpose and ethos of a smart city surrounds a fundamental principle, which is guided towards better living of the citizen and an effective functioning system, which is the city. Ultimately, the drive is to make the city more agile, resilient to threat, and sustainable. However, often when we discuss smart cities, we either focus on the tenets of smart, or we look at the unit of analysis being a city. What if we had to expand that unit of analysis to be a region? Would that alleviate, or would that help address more of the wicked challenges that we know? Well, to discuss this and more, we've got with us Associate Professor Malcolm Campbell from the University of Canterbury School of Earth and Environment. Malcolm is a regional scientist and a health geographer. He's been working on many issues surrounding social and spatial inequalities, and he's going to join us today talking about regional science and how that intersects with smart cities. Malcolm, thanks for being with us.
Good to be here.
Let's start off with the first question. What is regional science and how does that intersect with smart cities?
Regional science is kind of about how the essence of the region, if you like, is distinct from some other geographies. It's slightly larger than a city. It could be like the whole of Canterbury as an example. But it's this idea that there's something sort of distinct about the region that needs study in its own right.
So how does that intersect with elements of smart cities? So when we talk about technology, we talk about data, we talk about better living standards for people. How does that interplay with regional science?
So the city, I guess, is a much smaller unit of analysis, if you like, but in terms of population, some of our regions, particularly in New Zealand, are about the size of other large cities, right? Mm-hmm. So we might think about smart region rather than necessarily just a smart city. Mm-hmm. So having some idea of our broader kind of economic and social problems or issues or opportunities at the regional level is actually quite important in a smaller country.
Right. Can you give us some context in terms of regional science, using New Zealand or even Canterbury as a region, and what are some of those tricky challenges that a region would face as opposed to a city?
Somewhere like New Zealand particularly, I guess one of the things is to do with how spread out our population is. Mm-hmm. So for some regions, we might experience large amounts of population growth, and for other regions, we might be experiencing population decline. So region by region, that really matters, who's going up and who's going down in terms of population, and that forces us to make all sorts of different decisions depending on where exactly those trajectories are going forwards. So we've done a lot of research in kind of the regional development space, looking at things like tourism, health, region by region, and seeing what's different or what's the same between places.
Let's take the example of health.
Yeah.
How do you contextualize regional health within that smart city ecosystem using the same principles?
So you would see, say, for example, disparities in something like life expectancy across different regions in New Zealand. So some places you live much longer than other places. So that's my kind of interest as a health geographer. And then as a regional scientist, I've also done some economics. And so understanding how things like, say, wealth and health are linked is really important in a regional development context.
Do you see regions in New Zealand addressing some of those challenges better than other parts of the world?
I think New Zealand is quite distinct in that it's a small country, right? So if you're centred in somewhere like Europe, you have a huge bureaucratic machine funneling money into different regions, quite large amounts of money. New Zealand doesn't really have that in quite the same way. We don't have some huge pot of money to divert. We have much smaller bits and pieces of money. So our constraints, if you like, are actually quite important to understand in terms of the regions.
And when you look at regional science as a discipline to study, when we think about smart cities, we know there are local city councils that run some of the city programs. When you think about a region, where does that responsibility lie? And how do you get the community to converge around some of these regional challenges?
It's quite tricky, isn't it? Because the smart city is kind of this niche thing, right, where we focus on these urban centres and we kind of forget about everything else that happens outside the city. And so perhaps during like the earthquakes in Christchurch, you've seen that actually there's a lot of activity taking place outside the city boundaries that's really important for our kind of economic well-being. So I think that sort of idea is particularly important in understanding that the city itself can't survive without the wider context.
Are there those tricky, wicked problems where the city cannot function without the region?
Yeah, I guess it's partly a wider economic base to draw on as well. So there's more kind of diversity than just what's seen in the city. And also, I don't know about you, but for some of us, we actually like to get out of the city every so often. So having these places to have sort of recreational or tourism opportunities, for example, it's actually really quite important for well-being, generally speaking.
So Malcolm, how do you see cities converging around a regional agenda?
I guess the city and the region are kind of interconnected, right? So somewhere like Christchurch as our example, if you think about the wider economy and how that's linked more strongly to the city, you've seen it after the earthquakes, how the region supported the city post-earthquake.
Do you see the next phase of development in the smart city context being a focus around smart regions?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's interesting about the smart city space is that we've had this, I guess, focus on really big global cities, so whether it's New York or London or Shanghai, and actually that's not necessarily the experience of lots of people who live in cities, perhaps smaller cities between like 100,000 or 500,000 people. And so having that kind of more regional or smaller city focus, I think, is actually really quite important.
So in that context, one of the areas that is getting a lot of talk in the smart city space is technology and the role technology is playing in connectivity, using sensors, Internet of Things, all of that. How do you see technology playing a role in the development of smart regions?
Technology is great in the sense that it perhaps enables us to do something that we haven't been able to do before. And it depends if you're cynical or charitable in your interpretation of how these things either help or hinder us. So the usual example is something like how congestion will be magically solved by smart cities. It still exists.
It still does.
So to some extent, technology depends on us as human beings still in adjusting our behaviour. So the balance between us understanding how it works, us kind of having a desire to change, perhaps, and interfacing with that technology is important.
It's always a tricky bit when we start talking technology, because technology is an enabler in the way we should be looking at smart cities and how development takes place. But every time we talk technology, it's heralded as the technology being the solution to problems. And I think, as you mentioned, the behavioral change, the mindset change is quite critical.
Absolutely.
Are you seeing regions across the world doing well when it comes to deploying technology to drive some of these solutions or tackle some of the challenges?
That's a really interesting question. There's so many examples of these kind of smart cities projects, multiple places, and it seems to be easier to find the things that have gone wrong than the things that have gone well, which in itself is interesting. And I'm not 100% sure still why that is, even after all the research that we've done. But a lot of it seems to boil down to the idea that there's a kind of top-down solutions-based approach which doesn't quite gel with what the citizens or the kind of bottom-up is coming from. And it's that kind of tension between the two that seems to sort of get that disconnect going. And then ultimately some of these projects don't succeed because of that.
Yeah. And in your view, where does the responsibility lie for addressing that level of tension? I mean, a lot of smart city programs around the world are driven by local councils and governments or even the private sector to a large extent, without a whole lot of consultation or even involvement or engagement from the communities. So how do you resolve that tension? And if you can't resolve that tension in a city context, the expansion to a smart region, how would that work?
I guess there's a couple of answers to that question. So in my own personal experience, what's really quite interesting is that whenever we've been doing smart cities projects, we have a series of assumptions about how it should work. And so we roll out these projects, whether it's internationally or locally, and we find that actually it doesn't quite work because we've made some key assumptions that aren't quite true. So for example, one of the key things is around something called the digital divide. So we presume that everyone has access to the internet and smartphones and kind of gets it, but this doesn't turn out to be the case. And particularly when we focus on some of the more wicked social or health problems, that's even more exacerbated. So it seems to be that the most vulnerable are particularly kind of susceptible to either deliberately disengaging or out of choice not wanting to be involved. And so that's kind of the nub of your question, isn't it? It's sometimes we just don't want to do it, and other times we don't understand. So depending on where that goes, that's the kind of where the responsibility might come from.
So if we had to fast forward the next 3 to 5 years, how do you see the landscape of smart cities or smart regions evolving, and what responsibility should the community take on? What responsibilities should we as researchers take on? Where does the community at large, vis-a-vis the local government, the private sector, what sort of responsibilities do they take on?
There's a number of kind of different layers to your question there. So one's about us as citizens. And I guess, again, if we're being charitable, you assume that we want to be engaged in these things. We want to understand how they work. And so all of us can be involved. If you're in the private sector, perhaps you're more interested in actually selling product as much as you are in a better outcome. And so that's the natural tension of a profit-making enterprise. And then as a researcher, we sort of have to sift through that and work out, okay, are we going to be cynical or charitable about this particular issue? And I think my somewhat cop-out answer is it really depends, right? And it really depends on the context. So whenever we see smart city projects come from large cities, just plonked onto smaller cities, you see this kind of disconnect because we're not New York, London, Shanghai, we're a smaller city. So we don't have the streams of data. But because we're smaller, we can understand what people think much better about our project. And that's probably where we've gotten slightly further ahead of everyone else.
So I think the message is quite clear in that we need those channels of engagement, to be rock solid. And for smaller cities and communities and regions, getting that equation right will probably yield some of the long-term successes that other cities might have seen, but over a longer period of time. So great. It's been a great conversation with you, Malcolm, to learn about all things regional and regional science and look at how smart cities evolve into smart regions into the future. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you.